The first thing I want to talk about is what I did today. And specifically, I want to hone in on one thing, and it was a conversation I had with a local Polish person. And it was super interesting, I think, to highlight not only the Polish view of the war and the refugee crisis that's been produced from it, but also to talk about the current state of the refugee crisis and the state of the war itself, which I got a lot of insight from this conversation I had. So me and Geek, we were just walking around Lublin. We were just conversing, just talking after a lovely lunch we had at a local steakhouse. Wonderful time. The prices in Lublin are insane. I would recommend Lublin for great food, but a little bit lower due to levels of homophobia, which maybe I'll talk about that another day. But you wouldn't see that homophobia if you open Grindr. I tell you, go to any homophobic city in the world, you open up the Grindr app, and you just, no matter how homophobic a community seems, there's always a gay scene somewhere. Every single community, okay? That's not to say I'm opening up Grindr over here. Your thumb slips. Just, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, back to the point. So I was walking back from the steakhouse with Geek, and we were talking about COVID policy. And we were talking about why we're not seeing as much coverage of COVID policy, why we're not seeing as much coverage of COVID numbers, and why it seems like a lot of political figures have stopped talking about COVID. Why it's not as involved in the discourse, and hell, it's not even topics on Hippy Dippy anymore. We were trying to talk about, is this due to the fact that we've gotten so many vaccines out? Have we defeated COVID? That certainly isn't the case, but I mean, certainly we've gotten a lot of vaccines out. Is it political convenience? And we're just talking about it back and forth. Maybe we'll make a video on that in the future. Back to the point though. The guy was walking with us and he looked, I don't know how to describe him, how he looked. Besides, he looked like Vosh if he was Polish. So that's what we're just going to call him. We're just going to call him Polish Vosh. So Polish Vosh walks up to us, and we even commented, hey, look, it's Vosh over there, before he walked up to us. And he just starts conversing with us about COVID policy and why we think politicians don't talk as much about COVID. It was very, we go back and forth. He speaks extremely fluent English, and we find out the reason why is because he is a museum tour guide. Anyway, we keep going back and forth. We're mostly listening, because that's the whole reason we're here, is to listen to locals, talk to refugees, try to get their perspective. And eventually, through finagling, we get the topic over, and he says, part of the reason we get the topic over to Ukraine, and partially he did too, because he said that part of the reason he thinks people aren't talking about COVID as much is due to all of the attention on the war. And he was talking about how the Polish government has responded to COVID, because of course he's Polish perspective. And he of course says that he is extremely supportive of Ukraine. He wants these refugees to be taken in. We talk about how in Lublin, as is across Ukraine, it's actually, if you're a Ukrainian citizen, you show your passport, you show proof that you're a Ukrainian citizen, you get free transport, free public transport all across Ukraine, all across Poland, sorry, not Ukraine. This is to help Polish refugees move around and such. So he's supportive of that policy, so am I. But then he says something. He says, 2 or 3 weeks ago, if you were to be here in Lublin, you would see refugees everywhere. There wasn't massive amount, it wasn't like they flooded the streets or anything, but you would see buses, even in the middle of the night, full of refugees, of people wandering off, not knowing where to go. And he pointed over to a local mall and he said, over there in that mall, they would get off and they would go to that mall. Not because that mall was a center for refugees, not because that mall was particularly appealing to refugees due to something. It was the first major location, just somewhere to go, somewhere to charge your phone. Now, not nearly as many refugees. Either they've moved on to places, more major locations like Warsaw, which have better accommodations, or, and this is something he brought up, and this has been shown to be true from other reports as well, from other people on the ground, and from mainstream news, MSM, as you can call them, news agencies. They have said that a lot of Ukrainian refugees are starting to go back. In fact, he said, and others did as well, that he believes that there's more people actually going back into Ukraine than coming back into Poland. And of course, I find that interesting. I mean, the war started on February 24th. There was still brutal fighting in locations like Mariupol, around Kharkiv. There's still fighting around Kherson as Ukrainian troops close in the bottleneck. More Ukrainians going back into Ukraine than into Poland. And Poland's right there. It's like, if there's a place you want to go to, if you're fleeing Ukraine, it's one of the major options. In fact, I think it's hosting the most Ukrainian refugees. And when he said that, after the conversation ended and I was walking back with Geek, I started to reflect on why would that be the case? Why would it be that we're actually seeing more Ukrainian refugees going back into Ukraine? And I think this has to do with something. Now, we have a little thing behind me here, and I'm just going to use this because I don't want to pull it up on screen. If you look at the north here, the Russians started the invasion by trying, pushing in Donetsk and Luhansk and everything else, but they also pushed in. You see that little green spot? They pushed in there, right there. I'm sorry it's going blurry and then going unblurry. We'll have to fix the DSLR later. But that's Chernobyl. They marched in through Chernobyl. They tried to take Kiev. They marched on Cherniv. They marched on Sumy. They marched on all of these major locations. In fact, let's actually see if we can bring this up. 1 second. Oops, sorry, my Dragon's Quest music is showing. How embarrassing. Didn't want to show that. I'm gonna get bullied by everyone now. All of this up here, Kiev, Chernobyl, Cherniv, Sumy, which is over here. All of these major locations in the north, the Russians marched on. And the Russians failed. They failed to take Cherniv. They failed to take Sumy. They especially failed to take Kiev. They failed to take all of the major locations in the north. And 1 month after they marched into the north, they marched out of the north. To say they marched out of the north, I think, is a little, reductive, considering they were more pushed out of the north and they made a strategic retreat. Strategic, extreme air quotes around strategic. They were not even able to dispose of all of the war crimes they committed, all the evidence of war crimes they committed in places like Bucha, which were still continuing to remove and find the mass graves that they filled with bodies. We're still finding these bodies that they burnt with tires, trying to dispose of their war crimes. The fact of the matter is, Ukraine is taking back territory. They're taking back territory remarkably quickly. They took back all the territory around Cherniv, all the territory around Sumy, and everything around Kiev. If you live in any of these areas, while there is still the threat of Russian missile bombardment and artillery, and mostly missile bombardment, to be completely honest, the odds of you being captured by a Russian soldier or Russian tanks marching into your community is just not there anymore, because those troops are being redeployed into the east. To put it bluntly, Ukraine won the war in the north. They won the battle for Cherniv, they won the battle of Sumy, and they won the most consequential battle of the war, the battle for Kiev, the nation's capital, its administrative center. They won all of these battles. Extremely important for the Ukrainians. And so if you're a Ukrainian citizen and you're looking at this, if originally you would have said, I'm a Ukrainian, and Ukraine got invaded by Russia, one of the most powerful militaries in the world. I'm going to get out of here while I can. If you're a Ukrainian living in Cherniv, you have to flee because the Russian troops are coming right at you. Same thing with Kiev. There's a good reason for you to flee. The Russian troops are coming right at you. Sumy, same thing. Of course, Kharkiv, all these other major locations. Hell, even Lviv. No, Lviv hasn't really gotten a lot of damage done to it. It got a few missile strikes. Which, saying a few missile strikes feels feels wrong, because, if a few missile strikes hit your hometown, it wouldn't feel like a few missile strikes. But relative to the rest of the major cities, in locations in Ukraine, a few missile strikes is a few missile strikes. There's good reason for you to flee. You're worried about the oncoming Russian army. You're worried about regime change and what kind of government could be placed inside Ukraine if you are a political dissident. But now, a month on, when you thought maybe a month ago that the Ukrainian army would collapse, you would get a repeat of 2014 in Crimea when the Ukrainian military basically dissolved. The Ukraine of 2014 is not the Ukraine of 2022. It is a military basically up to NATO standard, using NATO-provided weapons to disembowel Russian armored units. Just wipe them off the face of the earth. We're getting tons and tons and tons of footage and just blatant photographic evidence of Russian units just being destroyed, pushed back. And the war in the north is the most obvious example of this, and soon to be the battle for Kherson, which is getting closer and closer and closer as troops of Mykolaiv and the north march on it, as the bottleneck continues to form on Russian troop positions in Kherson. Hell, there's even been a few rumors producing, but I just see them as rumors, of troops possibly leaving Kherson. So if you're a Ukrainian refugee which fled the country, thinking that this would be a repeat of 2014, thinking now Sumy and Chernihiv and Kiev are about to be occupied, you were mistaken, and you're probably pretty happy about not the general events, of course, it's still an invasion, but you're pretty happy that the Russians have failed. And you could be seeing this as a situation where, well, fuck, I think we might be winning. Maybe I should go home. I live in Lviv. There's no chance of them taking Lviv. Hell, I live in Kiev, and I thought they were going to take Kiev, but they just won the battle for Kiev. I'm going to go back to Kiev. I live in Chernihiv, Sumy. This would be the story across the board for these locations in the north. And so it's not that surprising, really, that we're hearing stories from Polish locals, me and Geek, my editor, my assistant, whatever you want to call him, of more and more Ukrainian refugees crossing over the border. And other reporters seem to say the same thing, that the Ukrainians are resilient, they are hopeful, and they think they can win this. And there is no better vote of confidence in a government strength, in the strength of your military, and your ability to win than refugees returning home. A lot of people have turned into refugees. Not the same number have stopped being refugees. A lot of people have left Syria forever because it is in a state of chaos and they have no confidence in the government of Bashar al-Assad. A lot of people have left Yemen and are not going back to Yemen anytime soon because they have no confidence in the war ending anytime quickly or in the ability of either the Saudi-backed government or the Houthis to win the war anytime soon. But we're seeing not only the population of Ukraine vote in for Zelensky during elections, he won 73% of the vote, or with polling, but they're voting with their feet. You know how libertarians say all the time, like, vote with your money? You know, I vote with my money. I buy from this company because I believe in the product. I believe in the whatever it is. Or I vote with my feet because I'm leaving from California to Texas or Texas to California, whatever. This is Ukrainians voting with their feet. They are confident. Wallet. Vote with your wallet. That's one of the libertarian sayings. But this is Ukrainians voting with their feet. Going back into Ukraine because they genuinely believe they can win. And you want to know what? I tend to agree with them. Anybody paying enough attention to the recent events in Ukraine could come to the same conclusion that I have, and it is that if they continue to get these weapons, if they continue to put up this resilient defense and they continue to have the high morale that they do, they continue to mobilize their population. I believe the last report was that 110,000 people, this is on top of the normal armed forces, have been mobilized for the territorial defense forces. Not only that, but that there's more people that could be mobilized, should be mobilized, and they just can't because there's so many people applying to be part of the territorial defense forces. And that manpower pool could be is further increased by the fact that if you are a Ukrainian citizen between the ages of 18 and 60, then you can't really leave the country. Ukrainian law. Actually, we have a translator that is willing to assist us in our interviews in Ukraine that we're trying to figure out that if they can actually come to Poland to help us do interviews with refugees. And that law might be an obstacle in that. So they are using every tool at their disposal, including the full force of the law, to increase their chances of winning the war. And so I wanted to highlight this specific interaction we had with the citizen, a Polish Vosh, the Polish Kharkiv kid finder, so to speak. I wanted to highlight this instance because I think it shows that it's not just strategists or commentators or reporters or me that is saying I think Ukraine can win. In fact, they might be winning. In fact, it looks like they are winning. It's also the Ukrainians themselves, including the people who initially didn't have much hope of Ukraine winning and or was leaving to protect their own safety. And now those very people feel safe enough to re-enter the country to either A, support the government, or B, just to try to resume their normal everyday living. If there's ever any sort of vote of confidence that you could actually use to show a people's belief that they can win, it's this. The Ukrainian people genuinely believe they can win this war. And I agree with them. Ukrainians are hard people, man. Good for them. That tends to be a problem as you go up in age, though.